The ballroom at Devonshire House was the centre of the world, and for Lady Alice Harrington, it was the night her life would begin. The man she loved, Lord Julian Cavendish, was about to propose. But the whispers of the tongue are cruel, and a heart can be shattered in a single sentence. When Julian's devastating announcement leaves her humiliated and abandoned in the centre of the floor, only one man moves. Not a hero, not a prince, but the silent Duke of Blackwood, a man who hasn't spoken a word in society for 5 years. His next action would send a shock wave through all of London. The year was 1818, and London was a fever dream of silks, scandals, and societal warfare. For Lady Alice Harrington, tonight was not about war. It was about victory. She adjusted the pearl buttons on her white gloves, her reflection staring back from the gilt-edged mirror of her family's modest Mayfair townhouse. Her dress, a pale blue silk, was 3 seasons old, but her lady's maid, Bess, had cleverly refreshed it with new lace. It had to be enough. "He will be enchanted, my lady," Bess said, her voice full of the same desperate hope that thrummed in Alice's own chest. He was Lord Julian Cavendish, beautiful, charming, golden-haired Julian. He was the sun around which her world had begun to orbit. For the past 6 weeks, he had been her shadow, at the opera, in Hyde Park, and at countless soirees. He had whispered promises into her ear, his words painting a future that saved her from the one she truly faced. Alice's family, the Barons Harrington, were teetering on the precipice of ruin. The title was old, but the coffers were empty. Alice's season was a final, desperate gamble. A good marriage was not just a desire, it was a requirement for their survival. Julian, the heir to a considerable shipping fortune, was that survival. And tonight, at the Duchess of Devonshire's annual masquerade, he had promised her an answer to her prayers. "Alice!" Her father's voice boomed from the hall. "The carriage is waiting. Do not keep the world waiting, my dear." Alice took one last look. The girl in the mirror was trembling, but her eyes were bright. Tonight, she would secure her family's future. Tonight, she would finally belong. Devonshire House was a galaxy of light on Piccadilly. Thousands of candles burned, illuminating the magnificent interiors, the famous art, and the glittering, gossiping mass of the ton. Alice, masked like everyone else, clung to her father's arm, her stomach a flutter of nerves. "Ah, Lord Harrington, and the lovely Lady Alice," a voice purred. It was Lady Jersey, the most powerful and venomous of the patronesses of Almack's. "I trust you are enjoying the crush?" "Lady Jersey." "A pleasure," Alice murmured. "Indeed. Lord Cavendish has been holding court by the champagne fountain all evening," the woman added, her eyes gleaming with malice. "He seems quite celebratory. I wonder what news he carries." Alice's heart leapt. "He's telling his friends." She scanned the room, a sea of masks, Roman gods, shepherdesses, mythical beasts. She saw Julian's golden curls near the orchestra. He was masked as Apollo, the sun god. It suited him. But as she moved to approach, her eyes were snagged by a figure standing apart from the crowd, shrouded in the shadows of a marble alcove. He was not masked. It was a flagrant breach of etiquette, but no one dared approach him. He was Alistair Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Blackwood. He wore no costume, only stark black evening wear that seemed to absorb the light around him. He was tall, broad, and imposing. The left side of his face bore a faint, silvered scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a relic from his time at Waterloo. But it wasn't the scar that made the ton whisper. It was his silence. 5 years ago, after the tragic fire at his ancestral home, Blackwood Manor, The Duke had returned from the war a changed man. He had locked himself away, and when he finally emerged, the man who had been known for his sharp wit and easy laugh was gone. He attended the necessary functions, a brooding statue, his eyes holding a chilling emptiness. He never spoke. Not to the Prince Regent, not to the Duchesses, not to anyone. They called him the Silent Duke. Some said he was mad, haunted by the ghosts of the war. Others whispered he was consumed by a grief so profound it had stolen his voice. Alice shivered, pulling her gaze away. He was a creature of darkness in this room of blinding light. She turned back toward her future, toward Julian, and forced a brilliant smile. Alice found Julian exactly where Lady Jersey had indicated. He was surrounded by his usual clique of fawning young men, laughing loudly. "Julian," Alice said softly, her hand touching his arm. He turned, and his smile, when it landed on her, was dazzling. "Alice, my muse, you look radiant as ever." He was masked, but the charm in his voice was unmistakable. He took her hand and kissed her gloved fingers. "Are you ready for the most wonderful evening of your life?" "I am, Julian," she whispered, her heart feeling so full it might burst. "I am ready." "Excellent." He grabbed 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to her. "Drink up, my dear. Tonight, we toast to new beginnings." For the next hour, he was the perfect courtier. He danced with her twice, a scandalous amount of attention. He introduced her to a Scottish earl, a man he referred to as his future business partner. With every smile, every shared glance, Alice felt the foundation of her new life solidify. The whispers of the ton, which had followed her for weeks, the desperate Harrington, still unsold, finally faded. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the orchestra's conductor tapped his baton. The music, a lively waltz, tapered off into silence. The chatter of the ballroom died with it. Lord Julian Cavendish, resplendent as Apollo, had stepped onto the low dais reserved for the musicians. He held his champagne glass aloft. "My lords, my ladies, your grace," he began, his voice ringing with theatrical joy. Alice stood just below him, her hands clasped at her chest. This was it. Her father caught her eye from across the room and gave her a proud, tearful nod. "You all know me," Julian continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "You know I am a man who appreciates beauty. A man who appreciates value." A few people tittered. Alice felt a prickle of unease. His tone was off. "I have spent this season in pursuit of the perfect match, a woman who can not only grace my table, but secure my future." "Secure his future?" Alice frowned. "My dowry is negligible. He knows this. And I am thrilled to announce," Julian boomed, "that I have found her. After weeks of negotiation, my dear friend Lord Montgomery and I have reached an accord." Alice's blood turned to ice. "Lord Montgomery," Julian turned and pointed toward the grand staircase, "I ask you all to raise your glasses to my future bride, the woman whose dowry will merge the Cavendish and Montgomery shipping empires. Lady Isabella Montgomery." A young woman, masked as Diana the Huntress, stepped into the light at the top of the stairs. She was beautiful, sharp-featured, and radiating smug triumph. The sound that left Alice's throat was a small, strangled gasp. The ballroom was utterly silent for a count of 3. And then the whispers began. He didn't. To Isabella Montgomery. But she's just returned from Bath. My God, he was courting Harrington all along, a diversion. Look at her face. She truly believed it. How pitiful. Alice's champagne glass slipped from her numb fingers. It hit the polished parquet floor and shattered, the sound as loud as a gunshot in the suddenly quiet room. Every head turned, every eye, every mask fixed on her. The jilted, penniless baron's daughter, standing alone in a pool of shattered glass and spilled champagne. Julian looked down at her, and the final, killing blow was the expression in his eyes. It was not apology. It was not regret. It was pity, a cool, dismissive pity. "Oh dear Lady Alice," he said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Do try to hold your drink. Such passion is unseemly." Laughter rippled through the crowd, polite at first, then growing bolder. Lady Jersey was fanning herself, her eyes shining with tears of mirth. Alice's father had gone pale, his face a mask of rage and shame. Isabella Montgomery descended the stairs, looping her arm through Julian's, her gaze sweeping over Alice as if she were a piece of discarded trash. Alice's heart did not just break. It detonated. It ceased to exist. She was frozen. She couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She was trapped in the center of the floor, the focal point of the ton's collective scorn. Her life was over. And then a shadow moved. From the alcove, the one place of darkness in the glittering room, a figure emerged. The laughter and whispers died instantly. The silence that fell was not expectant. It was terrified. Alistair Blackwood, the silent duke, was crossing the floor. He moved, not with haste, but with a terrible, inexorable purpose, like a winter storm gathering on the horizon. The crowd parted for him as if he were a phantom. He walked past Julian and Isabella, his gaze fixed forward. He did not acknowledge them, or the Duchess, or anyone. He walked directly to the center of the room, to the spot where Alice stood, shaking, her eyes blind with unshed tears. He stopped a foot in front of her. The room held its breath. The Duke of Blackwood, who had not spoken in 5 years, looked down at the ruined girl. He said nothing. Instead, he did the most shocking thing of all. He lifted his arm, scarred and powerful, and offered her his elbow, a silent, undeniable command. Alice stared at the arm offered to her. It was clad in the finest black, superfine wool. It was the arm of the most feared, most mysterious, and most powerful man in the room. Her mind was a white fog of humiliation. She could still hear the laughter, even though it had stopped. She looked up at the Duke's face. His expression was not one of pity, like Julian's. It was not one of malice, like Lady Jersey's. It was nothing. It was a mask of cold, carved indifference. And yet he was here. He had crossed the floor. For her, her hand, shaking so violently she could barely control it, lifted from her side. She placed her trembling fingers on his forearm. The moment she touched him, a jolt went through her. Beneath the fine wool, his arm was like granite, solid, immovable. Alistair Blackwood turned. He did not ask her to walk, he simply began to move, and she moved with him. He escorted her through the ballroom. The ton stared, dumbstruck. Julian Cavendish's face had gone from smug to slack-jawed. Lady Isabella looked furious, her moment of triumph stolen. Alice kept her eyes fixed on the Duke's shoulder. She focused on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. She would not run. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would simply walk. The Duke set a deliberate pace. It was not a retreat. It was a departure. He led her past the astonished orchestra, through the grand foyer, and out onto the front steps of Devonshire House, into the cool, damp night air. Only when they were standing on the pavement, away from the peering eyes in the windows, did he stop. The sounds of the ball were muted behind them, replaced by the clatter of carriages and the shouts of footmen. Alice's composure, held together by his silent strength, finally broke. A sob tore from her throat, and she swayed on her feet. She didn't fall. The Duke's hand shot out, not to her arm, but to her back, steadying her. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet profoundly grounding. "Breathe," he said. The word was a shock. His voice was not a whisper. It was a low, deep rumble, like stones grinding together. It sounded rusty, as if it had been unused for a very long time. She gasped, pulling in the night air, and looked at him. In the gaslight, the scar on his face seemed less a flaw and more a part of the forbidding landscape of his features. My family's carriage," she stammered, looking wildly around. "Blackwood," the Duke called, his voice cutting through the night. A massive, black, unadorned carriage, bearing a single, sombre crest, pulled away from the shadows where it had been waiting. A footman leapt down and opened the door. "Your Grace," Alice whispered, her mind racing. "I cannot. I must wait for my father." "Your father will be fine," the Duke stated. It was not a reassurance. It was a fact. "He is a man. You are a target." He gestured to the carriage. Alice, having no other option, climbed inside. The interior was dark, upholstered in black leather. It smelled faintly of old books and winter. The Duke followed her, sitting opposite, and the carriage lurched into motion. They sat in complete silence. Alice was hyper-aware of the man across from her. He was a void, pulling in all the light. She should have been terrified, alone in a carriage with the silent Duke. But she was not. The humiliation at the ball had burned away all lesser fears. "Why?" she finally whispered, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. The Duke looked at her. His eyes in the passing streetlights were not empty as she'd first thought. They were deep, and they held an ancient, terrible pain. "I know what it is," he said, his voice still that gravelly rumble. "To be consumed by fire while the world watches." Alice had no reply to this. The carriage did not take her to her family's modest townhouse. It took her to a grand, imposing mansion in St. James's Square. Blackwood House. "Wait here," he commanded. He got out, spoke to his driver, and the man sped off. Alice waited in the carriage for 10, 15, 30 minutes. She had no concept of time. She was in a state of shock. Finally, her family's carriage rattled to a stop behind the Duke's. Her father, Baron Harrington, leaped out, his face mottled with fury. "Alice, what is the meaning of this? You are gone, and I am left to... He stopped when he saw the Duke of Blackwood standing on the steps of his own house. "Lord Harrington," the Duke said. His voice, in the open air, carried an authority that stopped the Baron cold. "Your daughter is safe. I will call on you tomorrow. At noon." It was not a request. "Call on me?" the Baron stammered. "Your Grace, I don't understand." "Tomorrow. At noon," the Duke repeated. He turned, walked up the steps, and disappeared into his house without a backward glance. Alice, numb, was bundled into her own carriage by her father, who spent the entire ride home sputtering about the insult, the shame, and what on earth the Duke of Blackwood could possibly want with them. Alice said nothing. She just stared out the window, her shattered reflection staring back. The following morning, the Harrington house was a tomb. The servants tiptoed, the curtains were drawn, and Alice's mother had taken to her bed with a bottle of laudanum. Alice herself had not slept. She sat in her room, still wearing the ruined blue silk dress until Bess had gently, tearfully cut her out of it. The gossip would be all over London by now. She was ruined. No, she was worse than ruined. She was a punchline. At 11:30, Her father was pacing the drawing room, already drinking. "He won't come," the Baron muttered. It was a joke, a cruel joke by a madman. At 11:50, Alice came downstairs. She wore a simple, high-necked day dress of dove grey. She was pale but composed. If she was to be interviewed by a madman, she would not be found in her nightclothes. At the stroke of noon, a sharp, powerful knock echoed through the small house. The Baron nearly dropped his glass. The maid, her eyes wide with terror, showed him in. Alistair Blackwood, in the daylight, was even more imposing. He was dressed in severe, perfectly tailored riding clothes. He carried no cane, no hat. He dominated the small, faded drawing room, making the furniture look like toys. He nodded once to Alice, then turned his attention to her father. "Lord Harrington," the Duke began, his voice as flat and hard as slate. "Your Grace," the Baron replied, attempting a bow. I must thank you for your assistance with my daughter last night. An unfortunate misunderstanding." "It was no misunderstanding," the Duke said, cutting him off. "It was a public execution. Cavendish is a fool, but the Tun is a monster. Your daughter is ruined." The Baron flinched at the blunt words. Alice simply clasped her hands in front of her. "Yes," her father agreed, his voice small. We will be returning to the country." "That will not be enough," the Duke stated. "The stain will follow her. She will be the jilted spinster of Kent, or wherever you hide. Her sisters will not find matches. Your family is done." Alice closed her eyes. The cold, brutal truth of it was a second, sharper pain. "I am here to offer a solution," the Duke said. The Baron's head snapped up. "A solution? What solution?" The Duke turned his gaze to Alice. It was the first time he had truly looked at her. His eyes, a startling, icy grey, assessed her not as a man assesses a woman, but as a general assesses a fortification. "I require a duchess," he said. The silence that followed was more profound than any at the ball. The Baron choked on his brandy. A duchess." "I have obligations," the Duke continued, his voice a monotone, as if discussing the purchase of livestock. "I must have an heir. The Blackwood line requires it. I have no interest in the rituals of courtship. I have no time for the simpering debutantes your wife's friends parade. They are weak. They are frivolous. They would not survive a week at Blackwood." He looked back at Alice. "You," he said, "are not weak. You stood in the center of that ballroom and did not collapse. You have been tempered by fire. You will do." Alice felt her own voice return, and it was as cold as his. "You will do? Your Grace, you speak as if I am a horse you are considering for your stable." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes. "An apt comparison," he said, with no trace of humor. "A horse is chosen for its strength, its bloodline, and its resilience. I am choosing you for the same. I am offering you a trade." He laid out the terms, his words sharp and precise. "You will marry me. Immediately. Your name will be mine. The world will not dare to mock the Duchess of Blackwood. Not twice, anyway. Your father's debts," he gestured to a small ledger he'd pulled from his coat, "all £8,000 of them will be paid. Your family will be solvent. Your sisters will be given generous dowries, ensuring their own matches." The Baron was gaping, his face a picture of disbelief and greedy hope. "And in return?" Alice asked, her voice quiet. The Duke's gaze did not waver. "In return, you will be my duchess. You will manage my household. You will provide me with an heir. And you will be silent." "Silent? I live at Blackwood Manor in the north. It is not London. There are no balls, there are no parties. There is my work, the moors, and the silence. You will not question me. You will not pry into my affairs. And you will not, under any circumstances, demand affection or conversation from me. You will have my name, my protection, and my wealth. You will not have me. It was the most insulting, coldest, and most desperate proposal in the history of England. Alice looked at her father, who was practically vibrating with the urge to scream, "Yes!" She looked at the faded wallpaper of her prison. She thought of Julian's pitying smile. She thought of a life as a withered spinster, a burden on her family. She had been saved from the fire, only to be offered a fortress of ice. "Lady Alice," the Duke pressed. He was not a man who wasted time. Alice stood, her back straight as a steel rod. "You say you want resilience, Your Grace. Are you certain you can handle what you are asking for?" Alistair Blackwood stared at her, a long, assessing silence stretching between them. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. "I am," he said. "Then I accept your terms," said Alice. "We will be married. But know this. I am not a horse. I am not a broodmare. And I will not be your silent, cowering shadow. You will have your Duchess. But you will have me." The Duke's lips quirked, a terrifying, minuscule movement. "We are agreed. A special license will be procured. We will be married by the day after tomorrow." He turned and left, leaving Alice and her father in the drawing room. The entire world shifted on its axis. The wedding was a swift, silent affair at St. George's, Hanover Square. Alice wore her grey day dress. The only witnesses were her father and the Duke's solicitor, a Mr. Grimsby. Alistair spoke his vows in that same flat rumble. Alice spoke hers in a clear, steady voice. The moment the register was signed, they were back in his black carriage, heading north. There was no wedding breakfast. There was no honeymoon. There was only the relentless, pounding rhythm of the carriage wheels, taking her further and further from everything she had ever known. They travelled for 4 days. They spoke, in total, perhaps 20 words. The Duke was not cruel. He was simply absent. He would read reports, stare out the window at the passing rain-swept hills, and exist in a cloud of impenetrable silence. Alice, sitting opposite him, felt like a ghost. On the evening of the 4th day, they arrived at Blackwood Manor. The manor was not a house. It was a wound in the landscape. It was a vast, sprawling pile of dark grey stone perched on the edge of desolate, wind-swept moors. It was forbidding, Gothic, and seemed to crouch under the bruised purple sky like a beast at rest. As the carriage rolled to a stop, the massive front doors opened. A line of servants stood in the entryway, but it was the woman at their head who held Alice's attention. She was older, dressed in severe black, her grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed painful. Her face was all sharp angles and disapproval. "Your Grace," she said, dipping a curtsy to the Duke, her voice a reedy whisper. She ignored Alice completely. "Mrs. Croft," Alistair nodded. "This is the Duchess. See that she is settled." It was the first and last instruction he gave. He did not help Alice from the carriage. He did not escort her inside. He simply strode past the line of servants, tracked mud onto the black and white marble floor, and disappeared down a dark hallway, calling, "Grimsby, my study. Now." Alice was left in the grand, freezing hall, with the staring servants and the imposing housekeeper. "Her Grace, the Duchess," Alice said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. Mrs. Croft's eyes, small and black as currants, finally settled on her. "My lady, this way. Your rooms are in the east wing. The Duke resides in the west." The message was clear. They were to be as separate in this house as they were in the carriage. The next few weeks were a lesson in isolation. Blackwood Manor was a labyrinth of shadows and silence. The servants, loyal to Mrs. Croft, who in turn was loyal only to the Duke, treated Alice with a cold, fearful deference. They would not meet her eye. They answered her questions with, "Yes, Your Grace," and "No, Your Grace," and nothing more. Her husband was a phantom. He spent his days and most of his nights locked in his study or riding alone on the moors. They took their meals separately, he in his study, she in the vast, echoing dining room, alone at a table set for 30. The house was cold. A deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the Yorkshire weather. Alice tried to be the Duchess he had demanded. She asked Mrs. Croft for the account books. "The Duke handles the accounts, Your Grace," the housekeeper replied, her face impassive. "Then the menus. I should like to plan the Duke has his preferences. I am aware of them. The household, then, the linens, the staff. All is in order, Your Grace." Alice was a duchess with no domain, a wife with no husband. She was a prisoner in a castle, and her jailer was the house itself. But Alice, as the Duke had correctly surmised, was not weak. She had been humiliated, but she would not be erased. If she was not to be given a purpose, she would find one. She began to explore. The manor was endless. But there was one wing that was different, the south wing. The doors to it were locked. The windows were boarded over from the inside. When she asked a passing maid what was in the south wing, the girl turned white, dropped a stack of linens, and fled. Alice went to Mrs. Croft. "I require the keys to the south wing." The housekeeper's face, usually a mask of control, twitched. "That wing is closed, Your Grace. It is unsafe." "Unsafe? How?" It is the Duke's order. No one is to go there, ever. I am his Duchess. I am not no one. Give me the keys, Mrs. Croft." For a moment, the two women were locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Mrs. Croft's eyes dropped. "I do not have them. The Duke holds the only set." That night, Alice did something she had never dared. She went to the West Wing. She walked the dark, portrait-lined corridor to his study. She could see a single line of light from under the door. She raised her hand to knock, but his voice, his real voice, stopped her. He was not speaking to anyone. He was crying. It was not a sob. It was a low, ragged, animal sound of pure, unadulterated agony. A sound of a man being torn apart from the inside. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice broken. "I'm so sorry, Arthur. Papa is so sorry. I wasn't there. Genevieve. God, Genevieve." Alice's hand froze in the air. "Genevieve. Arthur." Alice fled. She ran back to the cold safety of the East Wing, her heart pounding. The Duke's silence was not from indifference. It was not from madness. It was from a grief so vast it had consumed his entire world. The house was not her home. It was a tomb, and she was now buried in it with him. Alice now had a new, terrible understanding. The silent Duke was not a monster. He was a man in mourning. The Tun had whispered that his first wife, Lady Genevieve, had run off with a lover, the shame of which had driven the Duke into solitude. They whispered the fire had been a minor incident. They had lied. Alice stopped fighting Mrs. Croft. She stopped trying to be the Duchess of the household. Instead, she started to be the Duchess of the grounds. She found a dilapidated conservatory, its glass panes shattered, its interior choked with dead vines. It was a project, a purpose. She ordered glass from the local village. She ordered seeds. She put on her oldest dress and a pair of work gloves she found in a shed, and she began to clear the debris. The servants watched her from the windows, whispering. The Duchess was digging in the dirt. She was mad. One day, as she was hauling a pot, Alistair found her. He had ridden in from the moors, his black stallion lathered. He sat upon the horse, staring at her, his face dark with something she couldn't read. She was covered in mud, her hair escaping its pins. She stared back, defiant. "Your Grace." He said nothing. He just watched her for a full minute, his grey eyes sweeping over the work she had done, the new glass, the cleared floor. Then he wheeled his horse around and rode to the stables. But the next morning, when Alice went to the conservatory, she found 2 groundskeepers waiting for her. "The Duke, he said you might need assistance, Your Grace," one of them mumbled, twisting his cap. It was the first crack in the ice. She worked for weeks. The conservatory slowly came to life, and as it did, she felt herself coming to life with it. She was no longer the jilted woman. She was no longer the ghost in the manor. She was the woman who was bringing the garden back. One evening, a terrible storm raged, rattling the old house. Alice, unable to sleep, went to the library for a book. She found Alistair there, standing before a roaring fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was staring at a small portrait on the mantelpiece, a beautiful smiling woman with dark, laughing eyes. Lady Genevieve. She was beautiful, Alice said softly. Not in the doorway, but from the centre of the room. He stiffened, his back a rigid wall. He did not turn. "Go to bed, Alice." His voice was hoarse. "No," she said. "I will not. I am tired of this. I am tired of the silence and the shadows and this shrine you have built to your own pain." He turned and his face was terrifying. "You know nothing of my pain. I know it is killing you," she cried, all her frustration pouring out. "I know it has turned this house into a prison. I know you are a good man, trapped in a nightmare, and you are too stubborn to ask for a key." "A key!" he roared, and the sound was a physical blow. He swept the brandy glass from the mantel, shattering it against the hearth. "There is no key. There is only the truth. Do you want the truth, Lady Alice? Do you, who cried over a ball? Do you want to know what happened in this house?" "Yes," she whispered, her hands clenched, though she was trembling. "Yes. Tell me." He laughed, a horrible, broken sound. "This house, this tomb. I was not here. I was in London. On business." "Business," he spat the word. "I was buying a damned sapphire for Genevieve, because we had argued. I was proving a point. And the fire started. In the nursery." Alice's hand went to her mouth. The nursery. Mrs. Croft. She got most of the staff out. But Genevieve, my wife, she ran back in. For him, for our son, for Arthur. His voice broke. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "They found them," he whispered, his body shaking. "They found them together, in the south wing. The smoke, it took them. But the fire," he couldn't finish. "The ton," he continued, his voice dead. "They said she ran away. It was cleaner, better than the truth. That the Blackwood heir and his wife burned while I was buying jewels." He looked up at her, and his eyes were raw. "My silence is not a choice, Duchess. It is a penance. Every word I speak is a word they cannot. Every laugh is a betrayal. So do not come to me with your gardens and your life, and tell me I am trapped, I am damned." Alice crossed the room. She did not hesitate. She knelt before him, and she took his large, scarred hands in her own. They were trembling. "You are not damned, Alistair," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You are grieving. There is a difference. What do you know? I know what it is to have your world end. Mine ended in a ballroom. It was shallow and it was vain, but it ended. and you were the only one who walked toward me. Now, let me walk toward you." She held his hands. "You are right. I cannot understand your pain, but I can sit with you in it. You do not have to be silent any longer. Not with me." He stared at her, his grey eyes searching her face. He saw no pity. He saw no fear. He saw her. "Alice," he whispered, the first time he had used her name. "I want the keys to the south wing," she said. He looked shocked. "It is a ruin. It is ashes." "Then we will clean the ashes," she said. "We will not let it be a tomb, Alistair. We will make it a memory, a place to honor them, not to hide from them." He looked at his hands, encased in hers. Slowly, agonizingly, he reached into his waistcoat. He pulled out a single, large, iron key. He pressed it into her palm. The opening of the south wing was not a simple act. It was an exorcism. Alistair stood before the heavy oak door for a full minute, the large iron key shaking in his hand. His breathing was shallow, his face pale and taut. "Alistair," Alice said softly, placing her hand over his on the key. "You are not alone. Not any more." He nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. Together they turned the key. The lock, unused for 5 years, shrieked in protest, the sound echoing down the empty corridor. The door swung open on complaining hinges, releasing a sigh of cold, dead air that smelled of ash, old rain, and something akin to burned grief. The wing was a maw of darkness. Alistair, rooted to the spot, was a man staring into his own grave. Alice, her hand still firm on his, took the first step, pulling him gently with her. "We are together," she whispered. They walked through the charred, soot-stained husks of what had once been beautiful rooms. The opulent wallpaper was now black lace. The chandeliers were skeletal claws of melted crystal. It was a ruin, a monument to the fire. Alistair was a ghost, his face a mask of iron control, but his eyes were screaming. They came to the last door. The nursery. Here Alistair stopped. He could not, would not go in. "I can't," he rasped, the word tearing from his throat. "Alice, I can't. This is... "Then I will," she said. She let go of his hand, walked over the threshold into the darkest heart of his pain, and looked around. The roof was gone in one corner, allowing a single, mournful shaft of moonlight to pierce the gloom. The air was thick. The small furniture was all but incinerated. And then she saw it. Half buried in a pile of blackened plaster and ash near what was once a cot, was a small, almost imperceptible shape. She knelt in the soot, her grey dress instantly ruined, and carefully dug it out. It was a small, carved wooden soldier, its paint blistered by the heat, its tiny musket broken. But it had survived. She stood and walked back to her husband, who was leaning against the doorframe, his entire body rigid with suppressed agony. She held out her hand. "This was Arthur's?" she asked, her voice impossibly gentle. Alistair looked at the toy. The iron mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The sound he made was not a word, not a sob. It was a guttural, wounded animal sound of a soul finally breaking free. He slid down the doorframe to his knees, his broad shoulders heaving. He took the soldier from her, his large, scarred hand enclosing the tiny object, as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. And he wept. He wept for his son, he wept for his wife, he wept for the 5 years of silence, the penance, the crushing, isolating guilt. Alice didn't just hold him. She knelt in the ash and soot with him, her arms wrapped around his shaking body, her cheek pressed to the top of his head. She became his anchor, his shield, the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into pure, agonizing memory. She said nothing. She just held him, absorbing his grief, until the first rays of the morning sun crept through the ruined roof, finding them not in a tomb, but in a sanctuary. They did not fix the wing. They cleaned it. They boarded the broken windows, and Alice, refusing the help of the staff, planted ivy and climbing roses at the base of the scorched walls. It became, as she had promised, a place of memory, not of haunting. With the Unlalistaire's locked wing, Alistair himself began to unlock. The silence, once a heavy, suffocating blanket, became a space of gentle quiet. Then, one evening at dinner, it happened. Alice was describing her losing battle with the stubborn, root-bound soil in the conservatory, which she was determined to restore. "And the Rose Bay is simply refusing to move," she said, sipping her wine. "It is as stubborn as a duke, I suppose. It feels it has resided in that corner for generations and sees no reason to cooperate with a new mistress." She had meant it as a quiet observation. She looked up and saw Alistair staring at her. His mouth was twitching. A strange, rusty sound rumbled in his chest, and then a short, sharp bark of a laugh escaped him. The footman who was pouring wine dropped the decanter. It clattered, but did not break, on the sideboard. Mrs. Croft, standing by the door, froze, her hands clasping the keys at her waist, as her eyes filled with sudden, shocked tears. Alistair looked as surprised as they did. He looked at Alice, and his eyes, so long clouded by storms, were clear. "I apologize, Duchess. My stubbornness is noted." "Is it?" Alice smiled, a slow, radiant smile. "Then you will note I intend to win, both against the garden and against you, Your Grace." He laughed again, and this time it was a real, warm sound. That night he did not retreat to his study. He sat with her in the library, and for the first time he told her not about Genevieve's death, but about her life, her terrible poetry, her love of strawberries, her laugh. And Alice told him of her father's absurd obsession with his prize-winning pigs. That week he moved his things from the West Wing. He did not command it. He stood at the door of her sitting room and asked, his voice quiet. "Alice, the West Wing. It is... I find I no longer wish to be alone in the dark." An entire year passed. Blackwood Manor was transformed. The staff, no longer terrified, smiled. There was the sound of dogs. Alistair had given Alice 2 loud, joyous wolfhounds. There was the sound of Alice's piano, and there was the sound of the Duke's voice, deep and clear, discussing estate matters with his bailiff, or more often, with his wife. Then the invitation came. Black, edged in gold, the Duchess of Devonshire's annual ball. Alistair held it between 2 fingers, as if it were a venomous snake. "We will burn it," he said, his voice flat and cold, the old Blackwood ice returning. "No," Alice said, placing her hand on his. She was no longer the pale girl in grey. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, radiant with health and confidence. "We will go." He turned to her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Alice, no, I will not subject you to that. I will not let those vipers sink their fangs into you again. I will not let them look at you." "They will be looking, Alistair," she said, her voice calm and strong. "But they will not see the girl they humiliated. They destroyed Lady Alice Harrington, and I thank them for it. Because in her place they created the Duchess of Blackwood." She straightened his collar. "They have been whispering for 2 years. First, that you were mad. Now they whisper that I am your jailer, a conniving country mouse who trapped a wounded lion. I am tired of their stories. It is time we showed them the truth." I do not care for their stories, he growled. I do, she said, her eyes flashing, because they are slighting my husband. You are not a mute. You are not mad. You are the finest, strongest man I have ever known. You owe me a dance, Your Grace, a public one. I will not be a duchess in hiding. His eyes searched hers, and he saw not a trace of fear. He saw only the steel he had recognized in her from the very beginning. He bowed, a slow, deliberate movement, and kissed her hand. Then we shall go, my love. And God help any man who looks at you the wrong way. When they entered the ballroom at Devonshire House, it was exactly 1 year to the day of Alice's humiliation. The moment their names were announced. His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, and Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood. The orchestra seemed to falter. The entire ballroom, a sea of glittering jewels and colourful silks, went utterly, devastatingly silent. The whispers started as they began their walk across the floor. My God, it is her, the Harrington girl. And him, he doesn't look mad at all. He looks furious. She's a glorified nursemaid, I heard. She trapped him while he was grieving. Shameless. Alice entered on her husband's arm. She wore a gown not of pale blue, but of deep Blackwood silver, the fabric shimmering like liquid moonlight. The Blackwood diamonds were a river of ice and fire around her neck. She was, by any measure, the most magnificent woman in the room. At her side, Alistair was no longer a shadow. He was a presence. He was still in black, but his waistcoat was silver, matching her gown. He was a duke, standing in the centre of the room, and his gaze was fixed, with open, protective adoration, on his wife. As they passed a fawning countess, he leaned in, his voice a clear, warm rumble, meant for all to hear. My love, he murmured, you are a vision. You have put every other woman in London to shame. The tongue was flawed. The silent duke had just spoken, and his wife was glowing. They were halfway across the floor when a voice, slurred and venomous, stopped them. Well, well, Lady Alice. Or is it Your Grace? Now. It was Julian Cavendish. He looked haggard. His golden boy charm had soured into a petulant sneer. His coat was rumpled, and he smelled of brandy. Clinging to his arm was Lady Isabella, whose sharp features had become pinched and sour. Their empire, it was whispered, was a sham of debts. Lord Cavendish, Alice said, her voice cool and smooth. A pleasure to see you again. And Lady Isabella, you are looking, well. You've done well for yourself, Julian sneered, his eyes filled with a jealous venom. From shattered glass to diamonds. A pity you had to chain yourself to a mute to do it. Isabella giggled, a sound like nails on slate. Alice's hand tightened on Alistair's arm, but before Alistair could detonate, Alice herself stepped forward. Lord Cavendish, she said, her voice not raised, but cutting through the silence. You speak of chains, yet you seem to be the only one present who is not free. You are a prisoner of your own spite, and, if the rumours are to be believed, your creditors. Julian's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Alistair Blackwood then moved, placing a protective hand on Alice's waist and drawing her back to his side. He turned his full attention to Julian. He was a solid foot taller, and where Julian was all soft rot, Alistair was battle-hardened iron. Lord Cavendish, Alistair said. His voice was not the flat rumble of before. It was deep, clear, and carried the effortless command of a man used to leading armies. Julian visibly flinched. You find it amusing, do you? That a man might be silent. Alistair took a step closer, and Julian, to his eternal shame, took a step back. My silence was born from a grief you could not possibly comprehend. It was a pause. But you, Lord Cavendish, your entire life is noise. Empty, shallow, and ultimately meaningless. He looked at Isabella. You chose value, and it seems you have a poor head for assessing it. He then turned back to Alice, and his entire face softened, his expression so full of love that the ton collectively gasped. He took her hand, and he bowed right there in the centre of the room. You were wrong about one thing, Lord Cavendish, Alistair said, his eyes never leaving Alice's. I am not a mute, and my wife did not untie my tongue. He lifted Alice's hand to his lips, kissing her gloved knuckles. She gave me a reason to sing. He then straightened up, his gaze sweeping over the shocked, silent orchestra. A waltz, now! As the music struck up, Alistair led Alice onto the floor. They danced, moving as one, lost in their own world, a kingdom of two. The ton did not just stare. They watched. They watched the silent duke laugh. They watched the broken-hearted lady glow with a love and power that was undeniable. Julian and Isabella were left in their wake, publicly rebuked and utterly forgotten. Alice, dancing in her husband's arms, was finally, completely victorious. They say that night the legend of the silent duke died, and the legend of the Blackwoods was born. Alice and Alistair returned to the north, not to a house of shadows, but to a home filled with life, and eventually the laughter of new children. They proved that a heart can be broken and still heal stronger. They proved that the deepest loves are often found not in the noise of a ballroom, but in the shared silence of two souls who finally understand each other. The ton found a new scandal the next week, but they never, ever forgot the night the Duke of Blackwood found his voice, all for the love of his Duchess. Thank you for watching this story. Do you believe in second chances? What did you think of Alice's courage and the Duke's incredible transformation? Let me know your favorite part in the comments below. If you loved this story and want more historical romance, more drama, and more twists, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that share button and send this to someone else who needs a story about love finding a way. We have new stories coming every week, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Thank you for your support.